All right, today we're looking at women's rights and the abolition movement. And I wanted to start by just talking about how difficult women had with these two things, because they were public speaking and really for the first time visibly were public speaking to groups of both men and women. Let's put this as like issues that they had, or issues. We'll go with that. So you had public speaking to both and the important part is it's not that women were public speaking, but they were public speaking to men and women. And then on top of that, both of the issues, women's rights and the abolition movement, were seen as within the public sphere. And it was because it was political. And that was decidedly the male role. And so because of this, and because it was the really first, we'll say, real public speaking that was visible, women faced a lot of backlash, especially at the beginning. Now, as they continued to push for these changes and continued speaking, that backlash didn't ever fully go away, but the early vitriol that took place against women was not as harsh over time, because, well, people began to accept it. And we'll look at some of the reasons that the Grimke sisters were more accepted than others, although even at the beginning they were not as well. And just because of the sheer number of women who spoke up, who went on these public speaking tours, it eventually became not, like I said, not as harsh of critics, but there were early women who faced critique and we'll say backlash over speaking. And the cartoon I have here is depicting, well, it's not depicting her, but it's about Fanny Wright. Her full name was Frances, but she went by Fanny. Fanny Wright was one of the early speakers for women's rights and then abolition as well. And she was a force to be reckoned with, and spoke her mind and was not shy when she spoke to the crowds of both men and women. And because of this, she ended up getting a lot of pushback. Katharine Beecher Stowe, who we're actually going to look at one of her letters to Angelina Grimke, also wrote about Fanny Wright. And this is what she said, and this is in your book. It's on page 244. There she stands with brazen front and brawny arms, attacking the safeguards of all that is venerable and sacred in religion, all that is safe and wise in law, all that is pure and lovely in domestic virtue. And so for Katharine Beecher Stowe, she's going to be a huge advocate for the domestic sphere and women. So one of the things we are going to talk about is the fact that not all women supported women's rights movement. Not all women obviously supported the abolition movement, but considering most of the women in the South. But even in the North, you didn't have everyone support the abolition movement, and you didn't have all women support the women's rights movement. There was varying degrees of what women thought that should look like. And those that were on the more kind of radical side of pushing for women's rights were usually not agreed with women who are more conservative in their thoughts. And that will eventually actually create a divide between the women's rights movement after the Civil War. So Fanny Wright, so you have this critique, right, that basically she's, and she was very radical. It wasn't just women's rights and abolition movement. She was anti-marriage for a while. There was rumors of free love that she was promoting that and other things. So she definitely was on the more radical side of kind of like all issues, and so that even made it easier to critique her of claiming she lacked moral virtue, which was definitely something that when they critiqued women who were public speakers, one of the things that was very common to come up was that they lacked proper moral virtue. And then, of course, as Katharine Beecher Stowe said, that they were failing the domestic sphere, which is where women were supposed to stay. So this cartoon, which was created during the time frame, it says a downright. And if you notice here, right, they put the W for her name. So this is definitely it was meant to make sure that Fanny Wright knew and other people knew that it was about Fanny Wright. But then they cross it out so it's, like means correct. A downright gabbler, or a goose that deserves to be hissed. And then it shows a woman with a goose's head speaking while a man looks on. And so right, it's saying that a woman who's just gabbing away, and so she deserves to be hissed or booed when speaking, and so much so, she kind of like said, I don't say paved the way, but certainly took a brunt of the criticism, is that her name got attached to a negative idea of a woman, which was called a Fanny Wright woman. So this was meant to be a negative thing, and it was any woman who publicly advocated any kind of radical ideas or even really spoke forcibly about things in the public sphere. Would be called a Fanny Wright woman. And so if you wanted to criticize a woman for speaking publicly, that's what you'd call her. So her name got co-opted as almost like a slur towards women. And so I think that the cartoon and the fact of her name getting co-opted just shows that, like I said, that women had to put up with stuff. And it wasn't just this. You also had physical violence against women who spoke up. There were attacks. Women were not precluded from being physically attacked simply because they were a woman, and so many women had those physical violence incidents that took place. So you really had to be strong, to be a woman in the 1820s, 1830s, when this was starting to really, where women were starting to come into the scene to speak publicly. Again, for Fanny Wright, one of her earliest speeches was in 1820. So again, because she was one of the earliest and the first to do this, she got a brunt of that. But you just had to know going in that this was going to happen and that your character could be maligned. You could lose your reputation. It could impact your family, your day-to-day life where you lived. And even still knowing this and experiencing this, women did not give up, and they continued pressing forward. They continued doing speaking tours. They continued pushing for what they saw as right. So this was definitely this crazy period of just women coming together and making their voices heard about what was generally seen as a public sphere, political sphere realm that didn't involve them. And like I said, they definitely, every woman that spoke at some point got critiqued. And we have stories from, like I said, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sovinger Truth. They all got crap at some point or another and responded to it often, usually with scathing responses that kind of shut up that person until the next one tried. And they all were definitely leaders that paved the way for women to continue speaking to where it became slightly more acceptable. We'll see, like with the Progressive Era and the continued women's rights movement in the late 1800s, women were still dealing with criticism. There were still cartoons, political cartoons that were made that were making fun of the changing gender roles as they saw it, and women's rights movement. So it didn't necessarily go away. We'll see a drastic change in the 1920s where there's less criticism for women and stuff. But even then, again, it's just something that is always there. But this was by far a really harsh period of it, because it was something new, because it was something that women had not really done so publicly in the past. Okay, so what we're going to look at first is the abolition movement, and then we're going to tie in the women's rights movement, because the reality with these two for women is that they you can't separate them. I mean, we're going to talk about some basics with each, but for many women, there was no way to separate being an abolitionist and also supporting women's rights. Very few were one or the other. And we'll look at the reasons for that, but certainly the recognition of their own struggle as they were pushing for the abolition movement. There was no denying that while they were not slaves, that their condition, their treatment, femme covert, all of these things within society, it looked familiar. We may not, and Sarah and Angelina Grimke said, we may not be on the level of slaves, that's for sure, but this is sure a different type of slavery, and that how can you separate and promote and push for abolition and then leave out women in the process? And then, of course, also Frederick Douglass, who was a freed slave, who was a major abolitionist and very influential. He actually criticized women interconnecting the two, and said the abolition movement needed to stand on its own, with which then a response from a woman came back saying, is that not leaving out 50% of your race in the process? I'm pretty sure 50% of the population are women. So how can you claim to push for abolition and freedom for African Americans and yet leave out 50% of the population in the process? And that was another argument with it, was that, well, how are we saying women are free if we free them from slavery and yet put them into the same condition we are? You're still not fully free. And that is that, there's that level of freedom, I suppose. And they're saying, well, we aren't slaves, but we're not fully free ourselves either. So it definitely gets interconnected, and it was near impossible to separate until the Civil War ends. And then you have women who look to continue to push on. And that's one of the things that happens, is that there's this kind of like, well, now what? Because women hoped for change when the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction and the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, women were looking for change and hoping that with the push and for those amendments, there would be concessions for women in there about their rights as well. And when there were not, then it was kind of like, okay, now where do we go with that? And that led to some split in organizations, and also a continuing push of others to continue the women's rights movement. So we're talking about it from a very specific time period here in this lecture today. We're kind of just going up to the Civil War. But we're going to revisit it in the Progressive Era, after the Civil War, the Progressive Era, and up through the 1920s and even after. It doesn't ever go away. That's my point. Women's push for women's right, they don't ever stop. They continue to push and push for change even after things don't really happen here. But this is, so even though we don't see, let's say, an end result where laws are changed after this period, for the women's rights movement, obviously for abolition, that has a different outcome. It's a super important period for women's rights movement because it set up a lot of the foundation that was built upon in the 1800s through the 1900s. And I don't think that women would have gotten to where they were in that period in the progressive era if they didn't have this foundational base that ends up getting established during this period. Okay, so the abolition movement. There's really, really early abolition. And I did mention these before, but I want to make sure that they're on the list, just so we have the kind of complete structure. You have the Quakers that they're complicated because they weren't really abolitionists, but this early abolition, you can almost put in quotations, because the reality is it wasn't full abolition. It was partial abolition, components of it. The Quakers outlawed slavery in their communities, and they didn't allow any Quaker to be a slave owner. What they didn't do until the abolition movement, though, was push outside of their society. Now, they become some of the most ardent abolitionists by this period. So I think that's important to note. A significant chunk of the Underground Railroad, the different homes that were homes as stops along the Underground Railroad, were homes that Quakers owned. So they were essential and key to that. Sarah and Angelina Grimke became Quakers. Lucretia Mott was a Quaker. So definitely a massive, massive thing. But if you're looking at, we talked about, right, during, but just before the Revolutionary War, they had already declared slavery illegal within their communities and forbid any Quaker from owning slaves. So you had this, I guess, localized abolition movement, which then they take into full-blown abolition by the time period when it actually gets to the North really mobilizing around that. And then the other group was called, for short, it was ACS, which is American Colonization Society. And this also was not out, so while the Quakers did it because they thought slavery was wrong, the American Colonization Society did not advocate for the end of slavery because they thought slavery was wrong. This was actually a Southern movement, and as it states in the name, their goal, I suppose, was to resettle freed blacks, black slaves from into Africa or the Caribbean. And this came about because there was a belief after the Revolutionary War that the slavery was ending. And so then there was this fear, as well as question and just general racism, of what's going to happen when you have the entire slave population free. And so they decided that what would be best is to basically take all of they, of course, not asking them what they wanted, but saying, okay, let's just ship them back to Africa, essentially was what this was. They actually did start a small group. This was in 1817. They did have a small group that they actually took of freed slaves and tried to set up a colony, thus the colonization component. But it was a relatively small amount before they stopped. And I mean, the biggest reason they stopped was because, one, it wasn't realistic, but also the short staple cotton and the resurgence of cotton plantations and slavery that happened in the South. And so problem solved kind of thing. So the ACS was definitely not pro abolition in that sense. It was just based on the concern of having a bunch of free black people around, and that either they would seek out revenge against slave owners, or the just racist belief of we don't want them here. And trying to look at what to do if slavery ended completely, which it appeared that it was naturally going to fizzle out because it wasn't financially viable until those changes that we talked about last time took place. So that's the really early abolition. And then actually I guess we also need to include gradual abolition, because gradual abolition did take place after the Revolutionary War. And gradual abolition was the idea of that you had a time period to free slaves. So the states would not immediately free slaves, but they'd be given a time frame. And this usually was 5 to 10 years. I think I wrote 5 to 7 in the other, but there were some 10-year plans. And then with gradual abolition, now there were various forms of gradual abolition. So it's kind of hard to say like this is exactly the layout, because different people advocated for slightly different things. But if you're looking at for a generalization, it was that there was the time period for anywhere between 5 to 10 years. And then by the end of the time frame, all slaves would be free. Children born during this time were free, and then or when reached 18. If they turned 18 before the 5 to 10 years was up. Then it was that there was compensation most of the time for slave owners. Compensation was a popular argument. And it did happen with some of the gradual abolition, because the argument was, well, we need the South to not rebel, which they do anyway. But right, the idea of like, how do we get the slave holders not to revolt? And then for some, it's just an argument of, oh, well, we're taking their property, and therefore we have to compensate them. So there was a combination of reasons why people wanted to compensate slaveholders. And there were some that argued for gradual abolition that didn't want compensation. But the majority, if they were supporting gradual abolition, they supported compensation. And then they usually were not, freed slaves would not be full citizens. So they were somewhere in between, or not equal rights. So again, it varied, which would usually be not full citizens. Someone said, well, they're going to be citizens, but they don't get full equal rights. So that's gradual abolition. This was the more conservative movement. This started after the Revolutionary War in some of the northern colonies that became states, and gradually spread to most of the northern states. So by the time that the abolition movement is gaining traction in the North, almost all of the northern states have freed slaves. And that certainly comes to some of the issues and tensions between the North and South, as you have a place where slaves can actually run away and escape to now to try to be free, and the North, because of abolitionist sentiment, begins to support this. So, like I said, this definitely was something that started before, because, like I said, by this time frame, most northern states were now free states. But it definitely furthers the separation and divide between the North and South. So that's early abolition, the various types that existed. I think it's the key to make with this is, besides the Quakers, even with gradual abolition, right, that didn't mean people who were abolitionists, well, not ardent abolitionists, but people who believed in gradual abolition, it didn't mean that they weren't racist. In fact, a lot were. So just because you supported abolition didn't mean at this time that you didn't have racist sentiment and ideas. And that's obvious with ACS, but even with gradual abolition, that was definitely the case. And that makes sense then when you look at immediate abolition that comes next. You have, whoa, nope. Okay, why did it always wants to go to other things. So you have William Lloyd Garrison, who is really the founder of the immediate or radical abolition. And it's called both immediate or radical, and the basic principles of this are kind of in the name. It was immediate abolition, so no gradual time frame for abolition. It needed to happen right away. It should have already happened. And he also argued that there should be no compensation and that they should be full citizens with equal rights. So what you can see why then this would have been seen as radical, right? I'll put that here because, like I said, it does show up as radical abolition as well. William Lloyd Garrison not only was one of the earlier individuals to push and promote immediate abolition in a larger audience and frame, he also created two different things. He created the Liberator, which was an abolitionist magazine or newspaper. This was created specifically to promote abolitionist ideas and immediate abolition specifically. And this is his very first. He was very, let's say, forward and I'm not saying now polite, but he was in your face, we'll say that, and in your face about abolition. And so the very first edition of the Liberator, he wrote like an introduction of why his position was this and why this was necessary. And this is a quote from this. And he was very critical of actually white Northerners who supported gradual abolition. So he wasn't just critical of the South; he was critical of white Northerners who he felt were being complacent. This is what he wrote. I am aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. He then continued to basically say that you guys are being stupid and completely complacent. The white people in the North are asleep, and telling me to calm down or take it slow, and gradual abolition does not work. Would you tell a mother whose child is trapped in a burning building to take it slow? Just wait a little bit, and continued on from there. And there's a whole bunch of examples of like disasters and some loved one dying, and saying like, you wouldn't tell them, just wait a couple years, just wait, it will, and take it slow. No, it is an immediate need. It is something that is an emergency and must be dealt with. People didn't take kindly, not all, there's obviously a lot of people end up supporting this, but there were a lot of people that were also like, oh, he's not a nice person. Because he was so forward, because he called people out, because he was not kind to those who he saw were complacent. So besides the newspaper, he also formed the American Anti-Slavery Society. And this becomes the foundation for a lot of the women's anti-slavery societies, and states too, but especially women are going to end up creating their own, and this was to promote the immediate abolition. Now, he was in full support of we'll put this here. It kind of goes together with Anti-Slavery Society, but that's fine. He was in full support of women's rights and women participation in the abolition movement. However, there were no women on as listed as members of the American Anti-Slavery Society. This leads to women eventually founding their own. The thing is interesting, you know, whether whoever that decision to not put them as members, because at the same time, William Lloyd Garrison encouraged women to speak. He encouraged women to be abolitionists. He seemed to support the women's rights movement, but they, like I said, when it came to the American Anti-Slavery Society, they were allowed to attend. And they actually helped out too, doing supporting roles, but they didn't lead, and they weren't listed as members. So it was a step that they were allowed to participate, and here's why it was a step. So we'll put that here. We'll put it over here. Women were allowed to participate. Well, and even not just participate, attend the meetings and helped. Why this is significant is because this was still a political association, not public. And political groups were for men. Usually, women were not allowed to attend these, or at least not publicly. And the example of that that I think is best showcases that was an International Abolitionist Society. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott ended up in London for the International Abolitionist Movement for meeting. And women were not allowed to attend the main meeting room. They had cordoned off this section behind the curtains to allow women to sit and listen but not be seen, because again, it moved into the political sphere. So that was your normal, and that was even still, like, they still were, at least they were allowed to listen. And other things, it was, no, you can't even come in. And so for William Lloyd Garrison and the American Anti-Slavery Society to allow women to attend the meetings visibly, to participate, to help, that was a big step. But not surprisingly, women decided that was not enough. They didn't like that they were not listed as members, that they didn't have more say and participation. They wanted to do more. And so you end up getting female anti-slavery societies created, where women then could be in charge and run the entire thing. One of the most well-known out of all of these was the Philadelphia one. And the Philadelphia one, and part of why it was well-known was because of its size. It was larger in size in participants. They also had, this was formed in 1833, 10% of the members were black women, which is a big deal, because this is the part where, again, that not all abolitionists or people who supported the abolition movement were also racist. because you had a lot of abolitionist societies and groups who did not only did they not allow women to attend, but they didn't allow black men or women to attend. So if they allowed women, they basically allowed white men only to attend, or if they allowed women, they only allowed white women, and black men and women were excluded from these abolition groups. So many of the female anti-societies, but not all of them, the anti-slavery societies, allowed black women to be members and to be on the board, to participate, and that was so the other part, right, was not that you were just a member, but they were called what were called officers. And so they were on the board of governing these societies. So the Philadelphia one was, like I said, most well known and probably most radical because it not only allowed black women to join, but also be officers in it. They almost all of the female anti-slavery societies they promoted immediate abolition. And this shouldn't be surprising because, again, it gets connected to women's rights movement and the fact that they were participating in the public sphere. And if they were willing to be open, vocal abolitionists, they usually were not conservative. And the Gradual Abolition movement was definitely more on the conservative side. So most of the women were pushing for immediate abolition, and we'll see the female anti-slavery societies usually got connected to women's rights. So while at the same time that they were pushing for abolition and the end of slavery, they were also giving speeches on women's rights. It was just impossible to separate the two. So they were also part of the meetings. And even, like I said, when you had these larger groups that were well known and had a lot of presence. So what did they do, right? Well, they gave public speeches. And this is where women, ended up getting a lot of flack and pushback. You're also going to have them be some of the earliest that are going to promote women. We'll put women's slave narratives. So just like with Sarah and Angelina Grimke, that their story people wanted to listen to, both men and women. Because the North didn't have firsthand knowledge of the plantations in the South. The female anti-slavery societies, including Philadelphia and a few others, and then leading women began to promote and push. They would publish flyers and have official speaking tours, where they went around and the women were paid, which was also a big thing. The fact that this was a job for some women that they could do and earn money outside of the home. That was a big thing too, which of course got criticism as well. But they began to push for former slaves to be part of the speaking tours, which one was a big deal for getting paid, and having them a job, but also the importance of sharing their narratives as slaves to people in the North that didn't really know the horrors and details of slavery in the South. And while Sarah and Angelina Grimke could give firsthand knowledge of being in the plantation elite society and the house slaves from their perspective, they obviously couldn't give a perspective as a slave, nor slaves from a plantation. So slave narratives became a really important tool of the anti-slavery societies in general, and for women especially, who promoted and encouraged women. So Sojourner Truth was a former slave, and she was on that speaking tour circuit. And there were several others that did this as well. And a lot of those early slave narratives that we have come from that. This faced pushback from that as well. Soon after the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society grew bigger, they actually got a new building. And only a few days after they, like, was it, not commission, but like celebrated the opening of this new building for their society, the women, after a meeting, were attacked, and then their new meeting hall was burned down. So there, right, we're talking about that physical violence and resistance that women had to, and they faced more than some because of including Black women in the group. So, which again shows that the North was not, there's sometimes this view of South bad, North good, but it's not that simplistic. There were plenty of people in the North who were racist, and yes, they thought slavery was bad for economic reasons or for other fundamental ideas, but not to go far enough beyond that. So they were adamant and against any type of racial equality, and these groups that supported it, which women were more likely to than men, were seen as a threat to that. And so they didn't have a problem trying to push back and stop that, either by attacking the women, and you get it twofold, because you not only get the racial discrimination, you also get the gender discrimination, and that leads to attacks. There was another woman who was talking about how she was in a carriage on her way to a meeting and was pulled out of the carriage by a man and hit before he took off, because she was well known and had given a speech about this. So you almost had to expect that that they were going to face opposition verbally, but also physically. And this wasn't the only attack. You had others who created schools during this time. Here, let's do, so that was the female anti-slavery study. Let's look at women abolitionists. So one of the things they did, this is kind of separate from it, but works with that, is that besides public speaking tours, several of the women ended up creating schools for girls, because again, tied to women's rights movement. And several of those looked to include and have it be mixed schools of both Black and white girls. And so you had this attempt of integration in these schools. One school, she had, it was Prudence Crandall. She had created a school for girls, and it was initially all white girls. And so she decided that she wanted to admit Black students as well. So it started off as all white girls school. And at start, she decided to admit Black girls as well. This led to the parents removing all of their kids. So they pulled all of the girls, the white girls, out of the school. So after that happened, she decided fine, and she reopened it as an all Black girls school, right? Because it was only for girls. And instead, if it's fine, you guys don't want to be educated, that's fine. I will still provide education for those who are interested. This led to, this got a ton of pushback at the time. Students, so these young girls were harassed and attacked verbally, more verbally than physical, because they were younger girls, but there was still some physical attacks. She was arrested at one point on trumped up charges. Her school was vandalized, and they like broke the windows. It didn't get fully burned down, but like the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society one, but was constantly targeted. So that there definitely was, when there was a push for racial equality, there was even higher violence than it was just women. But no matter what, like I said, you ended up with kind of both of these. So you had women, you had some early women like Prudence Crandall that set up an all-black girls' school, and then you had others that just set up girls' schools in general. The public speaking tours were a big thing, and we'll talk about Soldier Truth in just a minute. We have, and then the female anti-slavery societies, of course, but we also have, let's talk a little bit more about Angelina and Sarah Grimke, because their story is very interesting, and we only briefly mentioned about Angelina. So they were raised in a wealthy plantation, slave-owning plantation family in the South, right? Which was a big deal because, as I mentioned, no one had come over, defected from the South to be abolitionist. They were largely sheltered. Well, one of the things, they were well educated, which was unique for these wealthy women in the South. But much like other women in the South, they were largely sheltered from the plantation system of slavery. You can't avoid the house slavery. But they were not allowed on the plantation. They weren't brought there. They didn't go. Angelina mentions an early thing that happened when they were in town, and she witnessed, when she was very young, a slave being whipped. And she said later, when she wrote about this, she said that it so horrified her that she was never okay with slavery after that. And she ends up, both of them end up running away to the North. They certainly didn't get permission from their father to do so. Actually, Angelina left first, and then Sarah followed. They both converted to Quakers, to become Quakers, and then pushed and devoted their life to both women's rights and abolition movement from the start. So it wasn't like they were abolitionist movement first and then added women's rights. They were both ardent women's rights and abolition supporters. And very much like everything they did really focused around this. You look at like kind of all the stories of their life, and there wasn't much that they did that didn't have some center on this. So when I say devoted, it really was devoted. They made their own clothing. So at some point they decided that they weren't gonna, they couldn't in good conscience support anything that was connected to the institution of slavery. But that's kind of like saying today that you're not going to support anything that's connected to being made in China. And so clothing, because of the cotton and various food and other items, were all interconnected with that. Even if the full product wasn't produced in the South, there was a lot of things that were connected to slavery. They made their own, they spun and wove their own clothing. They farmed their own food, and they didn't do that because they enjoyed it. They did it because it was near impossible to purchase those things without, in some way, even if it wasn't directly, having a connection to slavery. And they said from the beginning, like, that when they started this, that at some point near the beginning of at least them becoming public figures, that they realized that it was hypocritical to talk about the evils of slavery and yet still benefit from it in terms of clothing or food or other items. And that level of devotion, that level of connection, even with all that all the other women did, which was a ton, I don't know of any story where another woman that was an abolitionist and a women's rights movement speaker went that far. They're like, well, spinning my own clothing and weaving, I don't have time for that. And some, you know, also said, well, we're getting clothing from Europe, and that cotton's not coming from the South. And there were a few that did that were wealthy enough to do that. If you weren't wealthy enough to do that, then if you were going to be committed to the idea of not purchasing anything, no matter how far removed but still connected to slavery, then this was the alternate route. But I think it's a great thing of showing that devotion to that. So the benefit or significance of these sisters was, one, that they provided stories of women and slaves in the South that no one else in the North knew about. And that was super important for getting the message out, for being aware of the conditions, just in general, of the horrors and stuff that, you know, were vague before they came in and were like, let's actually showcase what the issue is. And then it worked perfectly into women's rights movement as well, when you're talking about women in the South and the lack of rights that they ultimately had, and then connecting it to the North and saying, you guys, you know, in the North there may be some more rights for women and freedoms, but ultimately it's still restrictive. And they wrote so many treaties on women's rights and the abolition movement. So they were active writers and publishers of, we'll say, just speeches, letters, and the like, that would then get put in. They had a book too. Yeah, I accidentally pushed the button on that. Okay, good, it didn't pop up. Speeches, letters, and books. And these were used as educational tools for other women on how to speak about the abolition movement, about the women's rights movement, and all of that. They also made it easier for women to speak publicly to men and women. So they definitely got harassed as well. Oops, I didn't put easier here. One of the first speeches that Angelina gave and that she wrote about, she was critiqued by a minister or pastor, and who said that, you know, she was failing in her domestic role and it wasn't right for women to speak publicly to men and women about those political stuff. Like, basically, get back in your own lane. And she wrote back to the pastor, and it was a scathing rebuke of him, and also just she went through his arguments and one by one just demolished any type of argument she had, and then she published it so that everyone else could see it too. So, I mean, that's how aggressively forward they were with saying, no, we're not going to take this crap, and this is super important, and we don't care, what you think ultimately, because this is too important to sit back, and it involves us. And you can't, and one of the things she connected to that, and they very much solidified and I guess clarified the connection between the women's rights movement and abolition, because people were questioning that from the beginning. So made it easily to speak publicly, and we'll put to connected clearly women's rights and the abolition movement. And so what she said, besides making the connection, of course, that there were women who were slaves too, was that there is no way a woman who has experienced the oppression of society, the oppression of marriage, the rights and authorities that men have over women, the way that they are treated as lord and master over their wives and daughters, could not feel a connection to the abolition movement. And if they're pressing and pushing for change in the abolition movement, how can they leave out women in that process? And then again, so that's connecting to women that were slaves, and then saying, and then realizing as we're, doing, pushing for women's freedom as slaves, that we too also are basically beholden to laws and rules that keep us oppressed. And again, they always make clear, like, we're not comparing us to slaves in the South and the conditions and treatment of that type of slavery, but that the laws and rules and marriage of femme covert create its own form of indentured servitude or slavery itself. And so if you're going, and she argues, so if you're going to push for one, if you're going to advocate for abolition, it logically, you should be pushing for women's rights as well. And so that also helped other women solidify that connection as well. So they really were like, so as much as like Fanny Wright was one of the first women to speak publicly, and she took a lot of flack for that, Angelina and Sarah Grimke were some of the first to really be so forward in publishing and writing speeches and talking publicly and being able to stop the criticism. Fanny Wright was not able to stop the criticism. Some of the other women who tried to speak publicly on the abolition circuit when it was largely men were not able to stop that criticism against their moral character. It was a lot harder. People still tried, but it was a lot harder for any type of moral criticism of their character to stick. So they did try, but then you're like, well, people would kind of be like, they're Quakers, they're super devout, they make their own clothing and grow their own food so as not to use slave products. How does this actually work when you're trying to claim that they have poor moral character? And that's what got women a lot of the time, that made it hard for them to be taken serious, because then they became the Fanny Wright women. But that just didn't stick onto, as much as it would tried, it didn't stick on Sarah and Angelina Grimke. And on top of that, they had super important information that no one else had. So they could be like, well, men should be sharing this. Okay, find a man that grew up on the plantation elite that was a slaveholder so they can share. Oh, there's no one. Well, do you want to hear the information or not? And people were desperate to hear the information that it simply became less of an issue, and they were willing to allow it. But then as the more they spoke, the more they published, more women were able to jump in and speak. And so they really were that kind of domino effect and starting point to allow other women to speak on a much more open basis. It didn't make the attacks go away. It didn't make the difficulty of doing it go away completely, but it did make it more acceptable. So that's definitely one of their significance and importance with that. All right, next, let's look at let's do Harriet Tubman, and then we'll do Sojourner Truth. Harriet Tubman did do some speaking, although she was much more active and known for the Underground Railroad. So I'd mentioned that in the last lecture that she was part of the Underground Railroad, and was what was called a conductor. So she went, well, and I guess I should back up just a second, right? She was a slave. I mentioned that too. So I'm not going to get into too much detail with that because I talked about that last time. But she was a slave. She escaped and then spent the rest of her life working in kind of the direct aspect of abolition in actively freeing slaves, and then helping out in the Civil War, and then working during Reconstruction and helping freed slaves with housing, making sure that they were treated properly, and a variety of other things. She spent and dedicated her entire life to that process. So she worked on the Underground Railroad as a conductor. And specifically looked at, actually let's put that all under this, taking back as a conductor. So you go and you basically pick up people from plantations, secretly, obviously, and then escort them back to the north where then they're freed, which had a higher success rate because it was someone who knew what they were doing and knew where things were versus just hoping to find the next safe house. And she specifically helped the older people, women and children, as well as others. But these specific groups were harder to be successful, harder to free, let's say, because you were more likely to be caught. And so some conductors tended to avoid that because of, statistically, you were just more likely to get caught. Elderly people couldn't walk as fast or run and hide. Children crying and not being quiet when you needed them to. All of that was problematic. She was a master of disguise and misdirection. She actually became, and I'll tell you the story of that in just a second, she became the most wanted woman in the South. They had posters up of her, wanted posters, and I think it got up to $50,000, which is a ton of money back then. It didn't start off that way. They slowly kept increasing it as she couldn't get caught. So she would change routes. So why she was successful? She never obviously got caught. She never lost a person that she brought with her. She changed routes every time. So one of the ways that conductors ended up getting caught, or people got caught, was that a route was discovered or a safe house was discovered. And so the next time you used it, there were people waiting there. So what she did is that every time she went and took a group of people, she used a different route. And then that way, if a previous route or safe house, which she'd use different safe houses too, were compromised, she wouldn't be caught that way. And she also encouraged people to not stop. So there's this story of one of her earlier routes. And there was an older man who he got tired partway through and sat down and said, I can't go on, just leave me. And she said, no, I can't leave you here because he's like, no, you can, it's fine. They'll catch me and send me back. And she said, no, we can't, because if they catch you here, they'll know this is a route. And then that compromises everything. And so you need to come, you need to come. No, I can't go on, I can't go on. So she carried a revolver on her waist, and she basically went up to him and kind of tapped the revolver on the side of her hip and said, well, no, you're coming or you're not going back. And looking at her, the story goes up, supposedly, how much this is embellished, who knows, but he looked at her, looked at how serious she was and the gun on her hip, and then decided that he could make it the rest of the way. She also gave babies some bourbon or other alcohol to help them sleep so that they didn't cry on the routes. She also used a bunch of disguises because her face was plastered all over the South. So she dressed up as a really old woman. She dressed up as a man. She had a whole bunch of different outfits and costumes to disguise herself. And then there was one time where she was in town and she saw her old master there, and he was he was coming in her direction. So she went over to these chickens that were out and started acting like a crazy chicken lady, mumbling to herself and shooing the chickens. And he walked right by her and didn't notice. Another time, there were slave catchers that were actually on her trail. And so instead of getting on the train and going north, she actually got on the train and went deeper south. And they continued pursuing her, thinking they were pursuing her to the north, based on the assumption that no sane person would go deep, that was a runaway slave or an escaped slave or a wanted person in the South, would go deeper south to get away. So she just was brilliant in what she did. And she also did speaking tours, occasional speaking engagements. We'll just say speaking tours, but she wasn't on like a standard speaking tour, because most of her work was with Underground Railroad. And then on top of that, we'll talk about her in the Civil War, because she participated in that, as well as kind of a spy / leading a raid into southern plantations to free slaves. So she was super active and one of the most successful conductors of the time, and played a huge role in helping thousands of slaves escape slavery, notwithstanding, again, all the other ways she's going to keep coming back up through time. And then the other woman, and then we'll look at the women's rights movement, is Sojourner Truth, and there is let's see what page that's on. There is a 247 in your book. It has a brief excerpt of I Am as Strong as Any Man. So she was also a slave, and ends up eventually taking off. She was promised to be freed and then wasn't, and then she ended up taking off, and she became a major speaker at the speaking tours. One of the things that was unique about her was that traditionally the expectation for women as speakers was that they needed to be polite, well-spoken, and we'll say, and proper manners, because they intentionally emphasized this because of the negative connotations that were with the women being charged with moral character, right? We saw with Fanny Wright all the different things that she got attacked for. So there was this whole idea of thinking that women needed to make sure that they put on a very proper air to them, so that it was harder for men to, and sometimes women, to critique them of having poor moral character. Sojourner Truth didn't care, and she had a very big personality, and was very the opposite of all of those things. She was not polite, and she was not as well spoken as the others. She definitely didn't follow proper manners protocol. And the I'm as strong as any man, right? The fact that she was comparing herself to a man was seen as like, oh, don't do that. That's the whole point. We get called manly and not womanly. And she's like, yeah, I'm going to prove how this shows that I should be treated just as a man, right? So I am woman's rights woman. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and can eat as much too if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now. So, right, she takes the opposite of what they're like, no, we don't want to compare ourselves to men that way. We want to be equal, but we don't want to pretend we're manly, because that's it's the constant fear throughout society of women losing their femininity. In fact, in a later part of it, which is the ain't I a woman part, she goes and says, like, well, ain't I a woman? Doesn't that count? And someone in the crowd heckled her in one of these speeches, apparently. And so, yeah, well, you just gave us this whole list. I don't even think you are a woman. So then she apparently flashed him, lifted up her shirt and flashed him. Is that woman enough for you? So, which again, none of the other women could have gotten away with. But her personality was so much more bold and loud, and that was her personality, and she got away with it. No one else could have gotten away with that. And so it was also important for... we'll say what was I saying? Personality we'll just say loud and bold, and it worked for her. But she definitely spent a lot of time like sharing her narrative of being a slave and the conditions. But she also was working on women's rights in that process as well. So I put the title here of abolition, but a lot of these women, it was pushing for women's rights as well. So you keep it as both, right? That they were both looking at abolition movement, and at the same time gave speeches on women's rights and why women should be equal as well. They, like I said, they almost always went hand in hand. Okay, the next part. So that was that's what we're gonna look at there. I want to look at, with the women's rights movement, specifically the Seneca Falls Convention and the importance that that played in kind of setting up the scene and structure. So again, we kind of talked about women's rights movement in conjunction with the abolition movement. So what we're going to look at is the Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention was set up to get women and men, if they wanted to come together and discuss what did we, when we're saying women's rights, what does that mean? And so they were hoping to establish clear goals, which is ultimately important, to be able to have a clear concept of what is it that what were we hoping to accomplish? What does it mean when we say women's rights, equal rights? What is it that we actually want from that? And the hope was to create a formal statement. Oop. Oh, that's why is the charger not on here? Let me just charge it real fast. My battery, don't want it to die in the middle of recording this. So they wanted to set up a statement, a formal statement that would outline those and have everyone sign it so that they could hopefully use it as a petition to push for legislative change. Okay, so that was the goal. Around 300 people showed up to the women, and some men showed up to the Seneca Falls Convention. And they were looking to, and that was the goal. They had some speakers and things like that, but the end goal was that. And what they created was the Declaration of Sentiments. And the Declaration of Sentiments, we're going to look at that. So I'll write some stuff after it. Well, I'll write the key ideas and then we'll look at it. So the Declaration of Sentiments was meant to mirror the Declaration of Independence. So just like we saw with the Revolutionary War and how various groups use that language and that structure to try to show the importance, they did that here too. And so you have the preamble, which sets the reasoning, although they don't change a lot. This is most like the Declaration. We'll look at the key changes, right? And then you have the list of grievances. And this is all of the things that are wrong, right? Only instead of the king, it's against men. Okay? So the main things that we'll come back, well, say their main issues. We'll write these out after we look at the source. So the Declaration of Sentiments. No. Hang on. I want that to go away. There we go. Okay. Not now. Declaration of Sentiments. This first part here is the preamble, right? When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of earth a position different from that which they hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and nature's gods entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to this course. This is just saying when this happens, where there's a significant expectation of change and having to do that they should address it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, same as the Declaration, but here's the change, that all men and women are created equal. And then it goes into the same as the Declaration. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of those who suffer from it to refuse allegiance to it and to insist upon the institution of a new government, laying its foundations, and so on and so on. It works because they're just basically saying, like, look, just as the Declaration of Independence, as women, as citizens, the government was set up with the consent of the governed, and everyone has inalienable rights, especially because they added, women are created equal, that we have an inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if the government fails to protect those rights, it is the duty of the people to rebel and put in a new institution that will protect those rights. And then, the Declaration said we had this, and here's the change too, right? Such has been the patient sufferance of the woman under this government, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to demand the equal station which they are entitled to. So those are the changes, right? Everything else is the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. And that was very intentional to show the connection, to show their connection to those issues and how it was similar to what the colonists faced and felt during the Revolutionary War. But then they have these slight changes to establish that they're talking about women and women in the current government. Then they have the list of grievances. Like, right, in the Declaration of Independence, this list was the ways that the king sucked, is what I call it. It was all the ways that the king was abusing them or was a tyrant or did bad things. It was the ways the king sucked. Here's how, basically, this is the way, these are all a list of all the ways that men have abused, maybe not abused, but limited women, made them not equal, limited their rights. Okay, so one of the things I hope you noticed when you looked at this is he has. This was intentional, because you could have just written this, that women have never been permitted to exercise her inalienable right to elective franchise. But instead you say he has. And that was very intentional to say that men have done this. Men are not passive participants in women's lack of equality. Men have been active participants in preventing women from being equal. So that's very intentional. Let's put that one there, is that men have been active participants preventing, let's see, women from being equal. Okay, so that's that first one there. So the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries. So here, the same, but on the part of man towards woman, having in direct object the establishment of absolute tyranny over her. And then to prove this, let's submit the facts. So again, very slight changes, but now it's all different. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. That means to vote. So right off the bat, kind of like we saw with Abigail Adams, women setting up, and this is actually going to be the thing that's most contentious. Not everyone, there's plenty of people, women and men, that did not sign this because of this thing here. So that's what's interesting, right, is that the women's rights movement, you didn't have a collective agreement on what that meant, which is what the whole point of what they were trying to do here is to set up clear guidelines. When they say we're supporting the women's rights movement, then you could say, like, look, this is what we mean. But the problem is that even with that, you don't have everyone agree on that. And then there were plenty of women who said, well, we want better protections against abuse in marriage, and we want to be equal in this way, but we don't think women should have the right to vote. All right, and we'll look at Katharine Beecher Stowe in just a minute, right? Because that was the same kind of thing with that. So this was one of the most contentious ones on there. He has compelled her to, and there's a couple others though. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she has no voice, right? So this one is a continuation of that one, right? That women have to follow laws that she has no voice in. He has withheld from her rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners. So this is saying, right, that all men are given this, but women are not provided any of these rights. Having deprived her of this first right of a citizen, the elective franchise, thereby leaving her without representation in the halls of legislation, he has oppressed her on all sides. So it's just, again, also a continuation. He has made her, if married, in the eyes of the laws civilly dead. This is femme covert. So they're protesting against femme covert as well. He has taken from her all right of property, even the wages she earns, right? Which is because of femme covert, but that women couldn't own property once they got married, or their wages technically weren't theirs. They were their husbands'. He has made her morally an irresponsible being, as she can commit many crimes with impunity, provided they be done in the presence of her husband. Also femme covert, right? We talked about that. Which is an interesting one, right? We don't want to get away with crime. It's more just saying that, right, you're not treating women equal. Somehow they're not responsible for crimes if their husband is around. Like, that doesn't make sense. He has so framed the laws of divorce as to what shall be proper causes of divorce in case of separation, to whom the guardianship of children shall be given, as to be wholly regardless of the happiness of women. The law in all cases going upon the false supposition of the supremacy of man and giving all power into his hands. So this one is wanting for women to be able to divorce. Women got divorced because their husbands initiated divorce. They wanted women to be able to do it, and better protection for women when they're divorced. And of course, with rights of guardianship for the children. Most of the time, the husbands got to keep the children. There was rarely, so Fanny Wright, for example, her husband divorced her, and he got custody of their daughter, and she only got to see her briefly in the summer for 2 weeks every year. That was it. And that was very common, is that if your husband chose to divorce you, he got the kids and he got to decide everything, and the laws did not provide women with any kind of protection or avenue for that. After depriving her of all rights as a married woman, if single and the owner of property, he has taxed her to support a government which recognizes her only when her property can be made profitable. Right, so this is saying, right, for the, if single, right, then it's femme sole, so women could own property. And yet, she's saying, but we have to pay taxes, but we have no freaking rights. Why should we have to pay taxes when you've intentionally deprived us of all rights and representation in the government? He has monopolized nearly all the profitable employments, and from those she is permitted to follow, she receives but a scanty remuneration. And that, so just that there's very few types of jobs that women can do, right? And we've looked at that. Few jobs women can do outside of the home. He closes to her all avenues of wealth and distinction, which he considers most honorable to himself. She's not allowed to teach theology, medicine, or law. So they're saying, right, women are being kept from being able to do things that would give them wealth and distinction. He has denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education, all colleges being closed to her. We're going to talk about one in just a minute that comes up after this, but at the time, this was in 1848, the colleges where women were not allowed to go to college. He allows her in church as well as state, but in a subordinate position, claiming authority for her exclusion from the ministry. Right, so they can't be ministers. He's created false public sentiment by giving the world a different code of morals for men and women, by which moral delinquencies which exclude women from society are not only tolerated, but deemed of little account in men. So, adultery, having mistresses, right, would be moral delinquencies for women, but tolerated for men. And the argument that they make from this is you either get rid of the codes, of moral codes for women, or hold men to them as well. There was what's called the Comstock Act, and it was a moral clause. And technically it didn't say women. It was supposed to apply to everyone, but the only people who were actually charged with the Comstock Act were women. So, you know, they have this law for it that technically applies to men and women, which they tried to, you know, look, no, this is for anyone, but you only charge women with it, right? Here she's saying that they're saying he has usurped God by claiming it has his right to assign her a sphere of action, which belongs to God. That's the domestic sphere. He has endeavored in every way that he could destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. They cut it off here. So the other part of the Declaration of Sentiments is that they actually offered for each one of these solutions that they thought were necessary, such as either getting rid of the moral codes or holding men accountable to them as well. One of the other things that ends up being like controversial is that they said that women should be able to do anything men should do. In every way should be equal. And many people were like, yeah, but not this and this. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of the main women for the Declaration of Sentiments and Seneca Falls Convention. And some of those leading women that had been part of the abolition movement were doing this, right? You can see Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton were two huge names at this time. And the other thing to note, right, of course, is you have this list of women, and then these were the men in favor of it. But out of the 300, right, this is how many signed, which is not 300. They were looking for, these were the women. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, they were pushing for equal rights and stuff, and so they were definitely and were part of that immediate abolition movement, and they were definitely not wanting to take out things. They refused to take out the right to vote. They refused to take out the thing that said women were equal in every way to men, and that God intended. So this is where it also pissed people off, that they specifically said God intended women to be equal of men, and definitely was used in the Bible, the scripture argument against it, of saying, well, but no, Eve was created as for Adam's helper. And they argued against that and said, no, that's not what that meant. And women were created equal to men by God. So the fact that they wanted women to be equal in everything, and the other argument that women were created equal by God, those were contention points. But voting was still the big one. And so that's why out of the 300 people who attended, these are the ones that actually signed it, because others couldn't agree on some of those aspects. Preventing have been active participants. So we have voting that they challenge or target, femme covert, jobs, divorce, church, college, and moral codes. Right, there we go. So those are some of the big ones that we looked at. So these are all things that they specifically targeted as main issues and that they wanted to change. Right, not all agreed. Not all 300 participants signed. So the end result, right, from this was that at the time nothing changed. Right, so in laws, let's say, where it is important though, if you're looking at, okay, well, if this petition came to nothing, why is it important? Because it set up a foundation of goals and structure for the women's rights movement. It was the first time that the women had sat down and listed out and set up and say, what do we mean when we say this? Here is what we take issue with. Here's what we want changed. So the website I gave you, right, they often do that with excerpts. It's hard to find the one that actually has the resolved. So it has first, he has, and then they follow it with resolved, and each one of those, the list, has a companion that gives what to do to fix it. So they didn't just list problems and then not provide solutions. They did provide solutions. Not that everyone agreed to it, but they did provide them. So like I said, it sets the foundation for not only what they wanted, but ways that this could be fixed. And women use this as a guide through the progressive era, all the way through getting the right to vote. It became an important kind of guideline and structure for that. This also, the women's rights movement was definitely this idea of hoping to use the abolition movement, as I mentioned, to enact change in multiple ways. They also looked at local government change, hoping that if they couldn't change it at the federal level, right? So if not the federal level, then work on individual states. Where you first see change is actually Western states or Western territories that become states. Now, not necessarily because they believed in equal rights and all of that, but in the Western territories that eventually became the states, they needed/wanted to attract people. We need people, not attract. we need people in our territory. Come move here. Come settle, in Wyoming. Come to these new territories. So how do you do that? Well, one of the ways they decided is to give women the right to vote. So the earliest states that gave women the right to vote were these Western territories, Western states. Because what they believed with this is if they gave women the right to vote, they would convince their husbands and or families, I guess, to move west. So it really was about this ploy of how can we get our population to increase here. I know, let's give women the right to vote. Women will see that. They'll want to move here. And some did, but it wasn't, I think, as the flood of people that they hoped for. But they do. This is important. It's still important that you have states that began around this time to start giving women the right to vote, because then that's used also as a catalyst to push for additional change. Also looking to help support, right? They still can't run for government positions, but help support politicians that would support women's rights. And they continue to use this tactic until they get the right to vote. And that was helpful, right? If you can't get in there yourself, make sure you help support financially with getting the word out, being part of the campaign as much as they'll let you. And if you're supporting them, they're going to let you because they're supporting women's rights. So they intentionally sought out political leaders that they knew in local governments would support the push for women's rights, because this is ultimately how you get laws changed, how you get the votes, the laws changed, and support in voters to make new laws. Right? Since they couldn't do it themselves, they had to get people in there that could do it for them. And that becomes a continued tactic throughout. So then you also have differences in what women's rights were. As I mentioned, there were different groups of women, and at the end of the Civil War, they actually split into two different groups. But at this point, we're not quite there yet. We'll talk more about the specific groups when we talk about the Civil War. But you do have the, we'll just call it the radical women's rights, which, and at this point, there's probably like three groups. Radical women's rights, which included voting and full equality, and then you had they did not agree with voting or political aspects. wings. Okay, and so they were like the middle ground. And then you had the conservative, which promoted the domestic sphere and said, sure, we think that there should be protection against abuse and things like that, but the other is way too forward. A good example of this was Katharine Beecher Stowe, who was a well-known writer and author, and she interacted and wrote with Angelina Grimke. So we have, I'm just going to show something real quick with this. So this is from on the duty of American women, and she wrote a letter to Angelina to essentially criticize some of her speech that she had published about women inequality. So I'm going to skip some of it here, but I want to talk about the part where she goes, saying what's the issue. A woman is to win everything by peace and love, by making herself so much respected, esteemed, and loved that to yield to her opinions and to gratify her wishes will be the free will offering of the heart. But this is to be accomplished in the domestic and social circle. Then the fathers, the husbands, and the sons will find influence thrown around to them in which they will yield, not only willingly but proudly. The moment woman begins to feel the promptings of ambition or the thirst for power, her aegis or defense is gone. So, right, it's the domestic and social circle, and the husbands, the men, make the change. Whatever in any measure throws a woman into the attitude of a combatant, either for herself or others, throws her out of her appropriate sphere. And that was a dig at her, like, you're being too forward and aggressive. That's what that means. If these general principles are correct, they are entirely opposed to the plan of arraying females in any abolition movement, because it enlists them in an effort to coerce the South by the public sentiment of the North, because it brings them forward as partisans in a conflict that is begun and carried forward by measures that are anything rather than peaceful in their tendencies, because it draws them forth from their appropriate retirement to expose themselves to the ungoverned violence mobs and to sneers and ridicule in public places, because it leads them to the arena of political collusion, not as peaceful mediators to hush the opposing elements, but as combatants to cheer up and carry forward the measures of strife. Right, so she's saying, like, yeah, not only for women's rights, but the abolition movement is too political. Women should not get involved with that because it's an effort to cause issues with the South and conflict, and it's not going to be peaceful. It also exposes women to violence of mobs, sneer, and ridicule, right? This is the opposite of feminine, right? That essentially it's unfeminine to get involved in these type of things. And that includes women's rights as well. And the political world, of course, is part of that. So I just wanted to point this one out because I think it's important to show that there were women who were super strong advocates for the domestic sphere and did not think these other two were okay. Instead, they said, well, yeah, protections from abuse and things like that, but women's role is in the home. And you can influence your husband that way, but all of these other ways are unfeminine and not appropriate. And so it wasn't a single-sided push that all women thought women should get the right to vote. It wasn't a single-sided thing that all women thought that women should have equal rights. Those were controversial things in this time period. Okay, let's look at, the last thing I want to look at are the readings I had you do with the letters between Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Okay, sorry, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, not Lucretia Mott. That was earlier at the international meeting. So it's Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I added these, I paused it so I could add these. No, stop that.
because it takes a second to add these, and I can't add them at the beginning, otherwise I constantly have to move them. So this is from the book. Again, it's got my notes on it, but I wanted to, where I can, to have it where you can see it. So I just picked a couple of the letters because it does, these letters do a really good job of pointing out some of the things that they had to deal with, as well as just their thoughts and ideas of when pushing for women's rights, and the things that they noticed or were looking for. So in this first one, it's cut off, right? The title went right here. Okay, so if you look in your book, right, I just, because of the picture, so I could have this, it's cut off. So the rights of women, so that's the introduction part of it here. Yeah, the rights of women through the state of New York, traveling in stagecoaches and open wagons and sleighs in all seasons and on foot. Oh, I think I cut off the first sentence too. Anyways, it does continue. It starts earlier. We'll just put that. I just picked part of it to showcase for space, so I didn't have like 10 of these. The rights of women throughout the state of New York, traveling in stagecoaches and open wagons and sleighs in all seasons and on foot from door to door through towns and cities, doing her utmost to rouse women to some sense of their natural rights as human beings, to their civil and political rights as citizens of a republic. And then they would gruffly tell her that they had all the rights they wanted, or rudely shut the door in her face, leaving her to stand outside, petition in hand, with as much contempt as if she was asking alms for herself. So this part that I didn't have highlighted is talking about, right, the treatment by other women with them. And that's significant, right, when I was talking about that not all of them agreed. And but also just the conditions, right, that these women were willing to do and endure to try to get petitions, to try to get change, and then the treatment that they were given for that. And then the next one here, this is Anthony Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I hear that women's rights movements much talk and earnest hopes for its spread expressed, but these women dare not speak out their sympathy. Don't you think it would be a good plan to first state what we mean by educating the sexes together? This is going to be talking about the colleges, and we're going to talk about this one in just a second. Then go on to show how the few institutions that profess to give equal education fail. And lastly, that is the folly to talk of giving to the sexes equal advantages while you withhold from them the equal motive to improve those advantages. So that one was, so the first one was talking about, like, you know, the conditions that women are going through to get these petitions. This next letter was actually like laying out strategy for that. So right, this is 1856. 1848 was the Seneca Falls Convention. Now they're in 1856 with these letters. I'm going to scroll down just for a minute to talk about colleges. We're going to look at that more in the progressive era, just because that's when it really developed. So we're just going to look at what's established here. What are we on? E. Let's just say early colleges. So one of the earliest colleges established right at the end of the Civil War was for women. Well, it wasn't just for women, but that women could attend, was Oberlin College. So in the Declaration of Sentiments, one of the grievances was that women could not go to college. There were no colleges for women when they wrote that. By 1856, you had a couple colleges. The very first was Oberlin College. But what they created were female courses, and the only thing that women could take were these female courses, which taught like manners and domestic stuff, the domestic sphere, right? They weren't allowed to take the courses, no other courses allowed. And they actually stated the reason that they opened up their doors. So here we'll put here, opened doors to women. So it was an all-male college at first, but they opened up their doors to women, but only for female colleges. No other courses allowed. Then they specifically stated why they did this. To civilize the boys. Basically, they said that, and that was the quote, to civilize the boys, that the boys had rough manners, and they hoped a female presence would civilize them, would calm them down, would make them more refined. Right? So basically they're like, we didn't actually, so they didn't open up their college to women for, right, college classes for women that they opened up were really just for the men. Right? It's why they only allowed the female courses. They didn't have it. It was not women should be educated too. It was, these boys are getting really rowdy and rude and not proper manners. How can we make them behave? Oh, I know. Let's bring in the girls. Then they'll have to behave properly when women are around. Perfect. That's what we'll do. And that was the whole purpose. So that's what they're referencing here, right? Is because one of the huge questions, a later college, Vassar College, which we're going to talk about with the Progressive Era, was a college all for women. But as soon as these colleges, and a few colleges followed Oberlin's example and began allowing women to take female courses, but that was all they were allowed to do. But then the instant these colleges opened up these courses for women, a big debate took place, which was like, should women be in the college with men, boys and girls together, and being educated? It's horrible. It's not a good idea. And there became a huge debate between whether there should just be colleges all for women, whether you should educate the sexes together, or whether that they should be educated separately. So that's what they're referencing there. But it's interesting that they're talking about, right, that as part of the women's rights movement, there needs to be an emphasis on college education. And then I thought these were two that were important because it also shows the complexity of being a woman and pushing for women's rights and also being a mother. And so they're talking about the difficulties of being a mother, right? And so this is Katie Stanton to Anthony to Katie Stanton. And Mrs. Stanton, not a word written on that address for teachers' convention. This week was to be leisure to me, and lo, our servant girl wife had a miscarriage, and the mercy only knows when I can get a moment, and that is worse, as the Lord knows full well, is that if I get all the time the world has, I can't get up a decent document. So for the love of me, and for the saving of the reputation of womanhood, I beg you, with one baby on your knee and another at your feet, and 4 boys whistling, buzzing, howling, ma, 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 set yourself about the work. So she was writing to Katie Stanton to have her help her with her address. And then she's like, this. So there's all this stuff preventing me from working on it. And then Lord knows that even if I had the time, I probably wouldn't be able to come up with anything. So please, I mean, this is being, not, serious, but for the reputation of womanhood, I beg you, but look, 1 baby on your knee, another at your feet, and 4 boys, help. No man can write from my standpoint, and nor no woman but you. I mean, they were close friends, for all would base their strongest argument on the unlikeness of sexes. Those of you who have the talent to do honor to the poor, oh, how poor womanhood, have all given yourselves over to baby making and left poor brainless me to battle alone. So she's like, all my friends have had babies, and now it's just me doing this job. And that was an issue, because some women would press for it, and then when they got married and had kids, or when they had kids, they were either too busy to do, of course, they were 4, 6 kids is what it sounds like she had. She was too busy to go on the public speaking tours all the time. And so Aunt Susan B. Anthony is kind of like, I'm all alone with doing this because all the other women have had children and they're too busy. But she's asking her for her help. So then Katie Stanton writes back, is your speech to be exclusively on the point of educating the sexes together, or as the best manner of educating women? Come here, and I will do what I can to help you with your address. If you will hold the baby and make the puddings. It is not well to be in the excitement of public life all the time. You too need rest, Susan. Let the world alone a while. We cannot bring about moral revolution in a day or two. Now that I have 2 daughters, I have fresh strength to work for women. It is not in vain that in myself I feel all the wearisome cares to which woman, even in her best estate, is subject. Good night. So, and she does say, your servant is not dead, but liveth. So she's like, I've been busy. I'm sorry I've not written you. I have not died. I am alive. But, and then she asked about the speech, right? Is it supposed to be about the education of the sexes, or the best manner to educate women? But then she goes in to say, come here, help with the kids and the pudding, right? The domestic life that I still have to do. These women weren't just career women. They still had to be full-time mothers, full-time in the domestic sphere, cooking and cleaning and raising kids. And then they were also doing this. So she's like, come help with this, and then I will help you. But then she also tells Susan B. Anthony, like, you also can sometimes take a break. It's okay. But that because she now has daughters, because she had the 4 boys first, like, I have a renewed sense of feeling like this is important. But also I feel the weariness cares to which women, even in her best estate, is subject. I like that line. That the idea that, right, there's all these roles, all the roles and jobs that women have to do and try to juggle. And so, like, I think it's a good one to showcase that, you know, these women weren't one-sided, that they were multifaceted in having pushing and just unceasingly for women's rights, for education, for equality. And at the same time, many of them were married and had children and were still expected to be part of that domestic sphere. Even if their husbands were approving and supportive of their push for women's rights, they still were having to do all of this other work. And that just that normal aspect of how time flies because you're so busy and you have so many things you have to take care of and you're expected to do so. That was a part of their lives too. They weren't just pushing for women's rights and abolition, but they also were juggling traditional roles of women as well. And that was tiring, but also how they relied on each other, right? That there was many of these women formed really close bonds and worked together for all of their life to accomplish this. Okay, that's where we're ending. And this is where it's going to end for the test. At least for now, for this semester, and we'll be starting with the Civil War in the next lecture.